African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
What you will hear over the next hour are the words, ideas, reflections, and meditations by one of our important freedom fighters. Frank Chapman is a former political prisoner, longtime organizer, radical movement architect, and former member of the Communist Party. He is the educational director and field secretary at the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, CAARPR, and a leader in the campaign for an elected Civilian Police Accountability Council, and member of the Freedom Road Socialist Party. The range and scope, the breadth and depth of this conversation provides enough context that my normal introduction is not needed, at least at the moment. Be sure to tap into the work of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression and their upcoming conference. Details available at conference.naarpr.org. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly.
Position, you know, but they were trying not to leave the party. They try to maintain the party, so you know, and I joined up with some of those people, you know, fighting to you know, because it was our party. Why do I have to leave my party? So it was about getting the line changed, an ideological struggle within the party. We lost that one,
and yeah, you know,
we lost it decisively when the Soviet Union fell.
Yeah,
so the union collapsed. That put an end to that discussion.
And what we were just talking about just now was Harry Haywood's For a Revolutionary Position on the Negro Question. I just hit the record button just so we can capture everything we possibly can.
Okay.
You know, we possibly can. But like I was mentioning to you, Comrade Chapman, it's funny because we have a mutual connection by far or by distance, and that is Esther Cooper Jackson, who recently, you know, became an ancestor. And so I was actually having a conversation with Maurice Jackson, who knew them very well, very close. And so we were having a conversation and reflecting on the life of
Esther. Maurice too.
the Esther Cooper Jackson. And in that, I actually, interestingly enough, use your comments, you know, that you had gave, I think it was to the People's World, I believe it was, on your reflections of Esther Cooper Jackson to kind of open the introduction of that conversation. And so here we are about a year or so now talking and kind of connecting. So it's really... You know, obviously, you know, we have many points of entry into the conversation that we wanted to have today, but these conversations.
So you read my comments on Esther Cooper Jackson?
Yes, I did.
Before you and I ever met?
Yes, I did. I used them in the introduction of that program.
Oh,
That's
wow.
right. That's right.
Small universe.
Yeah. And I remember, Esther, having conversations with, Esther Cooper Jackson. I remember her mentioning you. I remember the work, and
Yes.
specifically because there's so much that, historical and, contemporary, there's that, I heard it, but I was kind of moving. And it's just the full circle, right? Just to be able to,
Yes.
and then meet you at, about a week ago at the National Council of Black Lawyers. As soon as I saw you, I was like, I had to come say something. Say something.
Wow. Wow. What,
Say
yeah.
something. Yeah. But I mean, we can open our open this conversation. One of the things I just wanted to make a quick note. I know that there's a lot of folk who do podcasting and all types of things. But one of the things that is that I intend to do with these programs is encourage people. So these conversations should be leading to work, should be leading to building and fortifying people's positions, critiquing people's ideological positions in order to organize, so these programs should be leading to work. Before we really get into it, do you want to offer some reflections on Esther Cooper Jackson as we kind of dive into, really robust conversation?
Well, I was given the first edition of Freedom Ways magazine when I was in prison back in the early 60s. It must have been around 1962 or 63. And this was the first edition came out in 1961. W.B. Du Bois was still alive, and Paul Robeson was still alive. And so it was a communist who was in prison, who was a member of the Teamsters Union that came to prison for allegedly blowing up a truck. He gave me a copy of that. He was a white communist by the name of Ulysses Grant Thompson. He's dead now. And he gave me a copy of that. And he said, this is a black magazine that's just now coming out. He was trying to interest me in communist ideas. So I read it. And I was so impressed with it until I smuggled a letter out to Esther Cooper Jackson, explaining to her my situation in the prison system and how I was really impressed with the magazine and how I would like to submit some of my writings to it. Now this was in 62 or 63. And I didn't get a response from her because I couldn't receive mail back in the prison. And so I gave her my sister's name and address so she could respond to her because I smuggled the letter out. But anyway, it was years before I got a response. But she kept that letter all that time. When Freedom Ways magazine closed, I was out of prison. I was in New York. I was at the it wasn't a celebration, but I was at the gathering where they was announcing the closing of the magazine. And she came up with that letter at that gathering. And she's kept the letter all that time, and that's what Esther Jackson was like. She immediately took an interest in my case, and I didn't get a publication in Freedom Ways until 1966. And so she had Jack Odell and John Henry Clark to both do an introductory piece to my article, which was on science in Africa, dealing with the African contribution to mathematics.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to say that article is actually available because there is a set that has been given to the Smithsonian by Maurice Jackson and his wife. So there's a whole set. So I actually have that article.
Okay. It's my first article in my life. And it was the first piece of work that brought some kind of national attention to my case. Because after that, a mathematician by the name of Claudia Zaslavsky became interested in and published some excerpts from it in her book, Africa Counts. So that all started with Esther Jackson. Mm-hmm. It all started with her, and I met other people through her. I met Claudia Zaslavsky. I met Dirk J. Struick, who wrote the introduction to the economic and philosophic manuscripts of Karl Marx, 1844, and all this through Esther. I met Jim Jackson, her husband. Every year they sent me a Christmas card because that's the only time that I could get mail from other people that wouldn't know my mailing list. They would send me a Christmas card with revolutionary greetings every year from 1962 on and up until the time I started to come home around 1973. So it was a very important relationship that I developed when I was in prison, and I maintained it after I got out. When I came home from prison in 1976, and I was finally paroled, I made a special trip to New York to visit with Esther Jackson and her husband Jim, and we went out to dinner together. So all these things are made possible by the movement. It's the struggle for Black liberation and socialism that helped me win my freedom. Such remarkable people like Esther Jackson, Esther Cooper Jackson.
Absolutely. And I wanted to back up just a little bit because you mentioned, when you were in prison, I mean, this is at age 19, right? You're coming in.
Yeah, I was jailed at the age of 18. I turned 19 while I was in the city jail when I went through the prison gate in November of 1961. November 3rd, 1961. I was actually 19.
And I want to make sure that we talk just a little bit about the Damn Don't Cry pages from the life of a Black prisoner and organizer, which is your memoir. People can go and get a lot of the background, and I want to hone in on your intellectual and political development. And so, because it's a fascinating story, because all of these things feed into each other. Because when we talk about Black liberation, most people have a very limited sense of what that actually meant on the ground, and also the repression and the structures that, young folk and older folk, coming out of a capitalist system, a system that is capitalist in its most aggressive form, right? A system that produces the Civil War, Jim Crow. And so then we get to, an 18, 19-year-old Frank Chapman, and you're in this particular space, you're being introduced. What is it that kind of propelled you to have an affinity towards these? Because of course, if we could get people to go read your memoir, we know the life that you had, as you were coming from, but there's something pulling you.
It's not mystical. I think all of us are driven by social forces, and I come from the working class. I come from one of the poorest part of the working class. My people were not lumpen proletarians, but they were very, very poor, off and on with the employment thing. My father got involved in drugs and crime at an early age. But my major experience was a working class experience of those workers in our society, particularly Black workers, who were chronically unemployed and who live in serious poverty, and that characterized my childhood, that characterized my early development as a teenager, and I was always rebellious towards society. I never really accepted my condition, Like people ask me, well, when did you join the struggle? And I would say, well, I was born in the struggle, because from the moment that I gained any kind of conscience about what was going on, when they started calling me niggers, and I saw how they were persecuting my people and whatnot. I was 13 years old when Emmett Till was murdered. I always resented how we were treated, and I was always looking for a way to rebel. And then Malcolm X popped up on the scene, and he had some influence on me even before I got to prison. I heard him speak one time, and I asked him about Vietnam because I had been drafted when I was 17 to go into the service, and this country was just getting involved in Vietnam at that time. I didn't even know about Vietnam. I just knew I was drafted, and I knew that I could possibly be in a war. And he told me, he said at a meeting that I was at, that's a war we don't need to fight in. If we're going to fight in a war, we should be in Mississippi fighting. And that stuck with me, And there were other influences from my uncles who were packing house workers and steel workers and things like that. How they had to fight against their bosses for a living and that type of thing. All those influences kind of came to a head when I found myself locked up in 1961, facing the death sentence, and it wasn't a question of whether I was innocent or guilty. I was going to be legally lynched, like Black folks were done, not only back then, but now. And so it shook me loose into thinking. And then I met remarkable people like the Father Clark, who I talk about in the book and whatnot, who were against the death penalty. So while I was in the state of rebellion, somebody just happened to pass on to me some literature about Marxism, and I'd already done a lot of reading. I did a lot of reading of books that you could get in prison. So I read a lot of the philosophers and whatnot, particularly during the Enlightenment period. I was really impressed by that, like people like Diderot and Voltaire and so on. I had a predilection towards materialism, because by this time I'd also became an atheist. So when Ulysses Grant Thompson gave me that book on Marxism, it was like, I'd been reading all this literature and searching through all the time. I was looking, how do I fight this system? What is the use of knowledge if it can't help you get free? I saw how Frederick Douglass used it to get free, so how could I use it to get free? And then I ran across Karl Marx, and I read the Communist Manifesto. Opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society, the history of class struggle, and then he describes the classes. Summed it up by saying the oppressor against the oppressed. Well, I knew who he was talking about. I knew he was talking about me. I was oppressed at the time I was reading it. So the identification was almost automatic and electric. Immediately I wanted to learn more about this movement. I wanted to learn more about communism. Finally, I ran across a thinker, a philosopher, who was talking about not what the world is like, but who was talking about changing the world, and who was talking about standing up and fighting back against capitalism and racist oppression, and so I started reading everything I could get my hands on, and there wasn't too much you could read in prison because they didn't have a lot of literature on Marxism, but they did have the great books of the Western world, and that was the only book in the great books of the Western world that I really treasured. It was 54 volumes. Marx is the last volume.
No,
it's either the last or the next is the last. It might be the next. Sigmund Freud might be the last. But there it was, and it was capital. And so I started trying to read that, and man, that was quite a tour, but a challenge. But I realized that this was science, This was a scientific approach to struggle. This was teaching me how to use science to bring about the liberation of myself and my people, mainly the liberation of my people. That's the only way you're gonna get yourself liberated. But so that's the story. That's the long and the short of it. That's how it happened. But I was prepared. It's like Marcus Garvey once said, "When all else fails, conditions will organize the people." So I was organized by the conditions of my life to get into this movement. It's that I went through, torment and the oppression that the system subjected me to. And I knew the reason why it was doing it was because of my color and because of my class. I was color conscious before I was class conscious. Color consciousness to class consciousness is not a big leap for Black people because 90% of us are working class, So, yeah, it's not a big leap. It might be a big leap for somebody who is upper middle class and Black, or who's petty bourgeois and Black, and who has another kind of class experience where they're aspiring to be capitalists and whatnot. But that wasn't my experience. I was working class, and I was part of the militant working class, the working class that was always fighting, always engaged in struggle.
No, this is very important, and I wanted to kind of punctuate what you're saying, or to highlight that when you said you were reading, because you read a lot of Du Bois as well. So what was that? How did that set the groundwork, to make that, not transition, but to make the to understand the continuities between race and class?
Du Bois was the best help, because the first book I read by him was Souls of Black Folk, but then here and there some other books, but I decided to read him chronologically because I wanted to see his development and see, like I say, it wasn't a big leap for me to go from color to class. With Du Bois, it was somewhat of a long, drawn-out process. But the beauty of it all is that I could see it happening, from the Philadelphia Negro all the way up to Black Reconstruction. I could see it happening. I could see how he was becoming more and more class conscious, more and more, not class conscious as a worker, but becoming more and more conscious of the driving force of history was class struggle. And his genius, enabled him to tie it all together. And so I was very much influenced by Du Bois. And the best work he ever did, in my opinion, is Black Reconstruction, because that's the book that slapped me awake in terms of what's going on in the United States of North America. He clearly shows the economic and political foundations of racism in this country, and he makes it very clear that it was profitable to the slave masters. It was profitable to the merchants in New England. Slavery was a business, the buying and selling of human beings. And he showed how that connected to culture and everything else. And so, I mean, I was a very close student of Du Bois. I read just about everything he wrote. I don't think he's written anything. He might have written some letters and some private papers that I haven't read, but everything he published, I read more than once. And my two favorite books was The World in Africa and Black Reconstruction. The World in Africa is an anti-imperialist piece. I mean, I pat my foot the whole time I was reading that book. That was before Fanon and Amilcar Cabral and all of that. Du Bois was he was an intellectual freedom fighter.
So you mentioned that you were patting your foot. You was riding the rhythms of his thought of anti-imperialism, right?
He's a poet too,
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
So the way he writes with rhythm.
That's right. That's right. That's what I mentioned. That's right. I wanted to make this very interesting, maybe not so known, but known in certain circles, the connection between Du Bois and his application for membership in the Communist Party, and Esther Cooper and James Jackson, who is the one that kind of recruited him, and and just to be a part of.
And they recruited me too.
As I was about to say, you know exactly where I was going.
That's how they were.
Absolutely. So, so in that, you're talking about this intellectual development, but also what is important is the people that are around us, right? You mentioned a little bit about, Esther Cooper Jackson, but Charlene Mitchell, Angela Davis are people who actually were on your, helping, making sure that your case rose to the level of national discussions that led to obviously you being free. But then this groundwork is very important, right? Would you and you mentioned lumpen proletariat, and those who would read your memoir would kind of see if you're looking at your development specifically, would you say that you were part of that lumpen proletariat before becoming a revolutionary?
Yeah. I'm kind of careful with that term, though. I was caught up in the cycle of poverty that was created by this system with regard to Black people. We last hired, first fired. The whole economic and national oppression that we're forced to live under is what drove me to crime. Even as a child, it was a matter of survival. I was hungry, so I was forced to get food and that type of thing by stealing and stuff, and I was no different than the hungry children all over the world. Later on, I read books and stories about the children in Brazil, about the children in India, living under colonial imperialist oppression. I was doing the same that they were doing, I was a street urchin, and so in that sense, yeah, I was a lumpen. But now, the word lumpen proletarian comes from the French Revolution. Actually, it's a German word, lumpenhund, raggedy dog. They were talking about a class of people in France. They call them the sans-culottes. They were talking about a class of people who were so low in society until they lived off of crime, and they were kind of parasitic to the working class. And during revolutionary struggles, sometimes they were very, very militant and whatnot, but they were not really stable. Criminals are not stable, but Black folks are different. With Black people, what you call a lumpen proletarian in the Black community is an unemployed worker. who's even denied the opportunities to get a job, who's denied the opportunities to be a working proletariat. A lot of people who are in jail, coming out of the Black community, a lot of people who turn to crime, if there was jobs, if they had the economic opportunities, they would not do that. I discovered that when I was in prison, because the most remarkable thing that I discovered when I was in prison is that although there was a lot of people in there that I knew from the neighborhood, most of the people from the neighborhood I didn't see in the joint. And why didn't I see them? Because they were going to work. I didn't see them because they were going to them steel mills out in Scullins. They was going to them packing houses. They was going to work, you know. Now, if the unemployment rate kept going up, then I might see some of them. But those are the ones who lost their jobs and who were forced to turn to crime, you know. So that's our story, you know. The economic conditions dictate, you know. And so I didn't want to be a criminal, you know. I didn't want to be a parasite on my people. This is how I responded to conditions in order to survive, you know. And when I got in prison, I began to clearly see that 90% of us who were in there, that was it. That was our story, you know. And so I went from there to thinking about how to get involved in the revolutionary movement. So when the revolutionary movement started developing in the 60s, guess what? A lot of so-called lumpings who were in prison became revolutionary minded, started studying and whatnot. Now, some of them returned back to that life because, you know, the economic conditions did not greet them in a very friendly way when they got out. But and a lot of them were not really connected to the movement. But some of them, you know, became quite extraordinary in their understanding of what the struggle was, like George Jackson, you know, and Bill Christmas, you know, Bill Christmas was in the same joint that George Jackson was in. His name is not hardly ever mentioned. He was killed in San Rafael with George Jackson's brother, Jonathan. He was also of a communist orientation. There were a number of brothers like that, you know, that turned towards the revolution. They just had problems connecting with a real revolutionary movement from behind those walls, you know. And I was one of the fortunate ones. I was able to, and George was fortunate in that sense too. He was unfortunate that he was murdered. But I could have been murdered, you know, the stuff they were taking me through. And I think if the movement had not become more powerful and whatnot, particularly with the rise of the mass movement to defend Angela Davis, I think I would have been murdered. It wasn't because of any special courage or ingenuity that I had going on. It's because of the movement and that I had sense enough to tie myself to that movement and work with it.
You mentioned tied to the movement. We talked a little bit about, and again, the reason why I'm trying my best to kind of truncate and kind of focus our conversation, because number one, we want people to go out and get the book.
But it's a lot in that book that I haven't said.
Right. Absolutely. You know, because I want us to lead up to the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, that organizing entity. But then, of course, we want to talk about, you know, the militarization of police, the role of Chicago, Palestine, Cop City, all of those things. We're going to get there. But what we're doing now is really looking at the development, your political, intellectual development as part of a movement. As part of a specific movement, and how we each are, how people get into movement. Like, what is that basis? The material basis, the intellectual basis, and how did they really connect? So no, absolutely, you definitely asked that. But let's talk a little bit about what tied you to the movement, because we got to be clear about your development as a communist, because that becomes important. And I also, I guess as a side note, I've been wrestling with this because I hear socialism as a mainstream term, but I don't hear folk really claiming, or actually, I'm a communist, or we're trying to organize for a communist organization, a society, because I'm dealing with this as well as a person who's organizing, as a person who's engaged, but also a person who is dealing with young minds, young students, to connect their material conditions to their intellectual development. At the same time, you have a university as a structure that's punishing, rewarding them. Help our listeners kind of understand socialism as that bridge to that particular type of society. Why is this important? Why is liberation? And again, you have a book, Black Liberation and Socialism, is another very important book that really kind of lays out your particular ideological stance, but also the historical stances of that as well. What are some ways that we can, what are some ideas and some clarity on this question of socialism, communism, how we should be really thinking about organizing at this particular point?
That's a hell of a challenge to address all of that on a few words.
We can have part 2 or 3, no worries.
What I want to say about the relationship between socialism and communism is that it's not just a thought process. Communists see socialism as a developmental stage in the struggle against capitalism. Socialism is a stage moving towards communism. And it's a very important stage because it's a stage in which the working class has to seize political power. As a communist, I believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't think you can be a communist and don't. So that distinguishes us from a lot of people who call themselves socialists or democratic socialists or people who are for socialist democracy. I believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means that the workers take state power, use that state power to take over the means of production, and to go about the business of reordering society so that we move in the direction of a communist society, a classless society. As a communist, I believe that the working class historical destiny is to abolish all classes. I believe that the working class's historical destiny is to be part of not only the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means we take control of the state, we refashion state power to fit the interests of the workers, but then we also use that state power to abolish classes. And then as we approach that ideal, there's no need for the state anymore. Once we end oppression, then people don't need an organ of oppression because that's all the state is. This is the short view and the long view in terms of communists. We see class struggle as the engine of history, revolutionary history, but we don't see it as classes going on and on and on and on and on. We see this particular class struggle that emerges under capitalism as being the grand finale, as being the struggle to end this. And we believe that, as you say in the international, the international working class should become the human race. We see this as being the destiny of workers, is to remake society where it serves everybody, from each according to their ability, each according to their needs, where there will be no hunger, where there will be no wars, where there will be no prisons and jails, and so forth and so on. This is just a dream if we don't have the instrument for making it happen. And the instrument for making it happen is revolution. Now, so people say, well, socialism has failed. Look what happened in the Soviet Union. Look what's going on in South Africa. They haven't even got started yet, Well, it's a process. Socialism is part of the revolutionary process. It's not the end of it. It's part of it, And there are going to be failures. There are going to be setbacks, But it's what we learn from these failures and setbacks that can take us forward. Like Marx once said, you can't stop stumbling, but make sure you stumble forward. And so that's the attitude we have with regard to socialism. As long as capitalism, imperialism exists, we're going to have to fight for our survival. Look at what's going on in Cuba. Look at what's going on in Vietnam. Look at what's going on in China. Look what happened in Russia. We're going to fight for that. In every little battle, we don't necessarily win, The capitalists are going to win some of them battles. But the historical process continues to go forward. So socialism has not been defeated. Socialism has suffered setbacks. But as a stage in human development, socialism is still emerging. It's emerging in every struggle that you see going on in the world. It's emerging in South Africa. It's going to be emerging in Palestine. It's emerging in China. It's emerging in Vietnam, And in some places, we have greater successes than we do in others. It's a historical process. It's a movement. And I believe that the direction of human history is to achieve communism. And like Du Bois said in his letter to the Communist Party when he joined the Communist Party, he described communism as the only way of human life. And if you go back to human development. For the longest period in human history, we existed without private property. We existed without jails, without prostitution, without crime. Almost 500,000 years. We existed without those things. And that was a sort of a primitive communism. But now, through the development of class society and whatnot, we've seen all of these things, but we know that they're not necessarily the human condition. You know, that we can do better, that we can have a society in which there is no poverty. But you know, we have to make that happen. Yeah. That's not going to happen because we have a dream about it. You know, we're not utopian socialists. You know, we're scientific socialists. We believe in making it happen.
To not linger too much on this, but I think it's an important part of the conversation. But also, as folk are listening to this from all over the world, as they're trying to work these things out on their local and national levels. You mentioned that, you know, you read the philosophers and, you know, particularly in the Enlightenment period. But one of the things that I think, you know, and Marx says this in various iterations, and C.L.R. James, other people who've taken Marx and really applied it to the conditions, particularly people of African descent.
Walter Rodney.
Yeah.
Amilcar Cabral.
Yeah, absolutely.
Agostinho Neto, Samora Machel, Nelson Mandela. I could name a bunch of them. And all the people I just named are black.
Right. Chris Hani, like you.
Chris Hani, my goodness. Yeah.
So just so to really piggyback, one of the things that I often use, I write about, I teach about, I try to reinforce this, is that one of the I'm saying this in tongue in cheek, of course, one of the gifts of that Enlightenment period was the creation of the individual as a justification for the maintenance of private property. The idea of the individual as opposed to class as being attached to a class consciousness, a collective consciousness of a group of people.
I think I know what you mean.
Yeah. So, you know, because
you're kind of waxing philosophical on me here.
Right. Right. Well, I'm trying to make it to the material.
Yeah. You know, people develop relationships with one another based on what they do for a living, you know, and people, oppressed people are going to always be trying to get free. And that's not just peculiar to capitalism. That's throughout human history. But now under capitalism, you know, and the Enlightenment plays in this. Under capitalism, for the first time in human history, people become conscious of things that they were never conscious of before, because we have a greater command over the forces of nature. People become conscious of the fact that the material conditions that we created under capitalism. See, there's never been a time in human history where there has been abundance in poverty. Usually poverty in all that past epochs and periods of history had to do with scarcity. Under capitalism, there's abundance. And so the material conditions for people not living in poverty exists. People used to see during a crisis of overproduction. In previous societies, there was no such thing as a crisis of overproduction. You mean you produce too much food? You produce too much? And so now you got to destroy some stuff. You got to throw tons of corn in the Gulf of Mexico or something so that you can restabilize the market. So the material conditions are here, and it's screaming at us loud and clear. The problem is that the distribution of the wealth is messed up. You know, that's why Bernie Sanders is crying about the 1%. How do you justify that? How do you justify so many billionaires in a country so rich, and all this wealth has been produced not by the billionaires? They're expropriated. They're not producing it. It's produced by us. For the 250 years of slavery up to the Civil War, all that enormous wealth in the United States, which helped build railroads and all of that stuff, steamboats and what have you, all of that was produced in large part by the slaves. But did the slaves enjoy any of that wealth? No. So the problem here, and it's not a philosophical problem per se, but we give the Enlightenment this credit. They had a consciousness to start thinking about it like Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, men are born free, even people are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. They start seeing what we're talking about. They start seeing that we now had social forces, economic forces unleashed that could create a condition of liberty for everybody. But that wasn't happening. And the reason why it wasn't happening is because the production was socialized. The factory system showed clearly as day, production was social. But the results of that socialized production, all the wealth that it created through slaves and proletarians, was privately appropriated by a class that was ruling society, and because it controlled the means of production. And the only justification that they had for taking that was that they had the power to do it. And so they created ideas that justified it, and so forth and so on. Like slaves are inferior, they need to be enslaved, workers get a fair shake on the market, so if they come out short, it's their fault. I mean, all this crap. But the reality of it is that, as Marx said, socialism as a scientific idea could not exist if the material conditions did not exist for it. The material conditions exist for it. And the only thing blocking us from getting it is class oppression, class society. And so we have to overthrow this society and create another one. Now, that's revolutionary. We're not talking about what they were talking about during the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, they were saying it was the ideas. They were saying that if somebody would have had a good idea 1,000 years ago, they would have saved us the trouble of having one now. They didn't connect it with social development. They didn't connect thinking with social conditions. They were thinking in the abstract, thinking consciousness is conscious existence, and conscious existence among human beings takes place in societies with language and culture and all that type.
No, we on the right.
I hope I cleared up something.
No, you did. No, you helped. So this, again, the reason why I say this is because, there's a question, there's still this question of race and class, right? There's still this, and so one of the things that I think is important is exactly what we just kind of laid out. As these ideas are being developed, there's a material condition, enslavement and colonialism that is there, that is built upon the racialization of labor, that is used to divorce Black and white laborers, being forced, particularly, first through plantation owners and then through the capitalist class throughout. So this use of the idea, but also its materiality with, race and then class, is all being mixed up, is what I'm saying. It's not being clearly defined scientifically, right? Based upon the processes of history, the social production of different forces and how that feeds to one's consciousness. And so you did exactly what I wanted to do, and I did throw in that. Thank you for kind of engaging in that little aside there. But yeah. And of course, there's many things, and the idea would be is that when folk, people get a chance to listen to this, it'll spur up, because one of the things that I think that, we have to be clear is that what these thinkers did was also show the contradictions and the importance of dialectical thinking in this particular process, particularly for Black folk who are organizing, right? I would say, they're talking about the idea, these particular things, but not really paying attention to, as you mentioned rightly, the other forces that are at play as they're developing these ideas, right? I think that becomes important. Which brings us to, again, this organizing. You were in your book, you talk about you accepted a teacher position when you were in prison and in this transitional period. So there was a school that was actually developed for a bridge for those who are coming out of prison and as they're moving back into society. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of that educational process that you, along with a collective of folk who were studying and engaging, understanding the material reality that you all were in, at the same time linking that to the conditions outside of the prison walls?
That was a development that probably could have only happened in the 60s, the mid and late 60s, when there was really a lot of social upheaval and social change going on in this country. And we in prison had written some professors at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, about taking correspondence courses once we got our GEDs. And one of the professors, one by the name of John Dom, he kind of came up with a better idea. And that was, how about we bring the correspondence courses into the prison and teach it there, you know? So he talked to the educational director of the prison, and what made them open to the idea is that so much change was going on in society as a whole at that time. And prison reform was one of the things that folks were struggling around too. So they said, okay, let's try it as an experiment. So they brought the courses in. They took the prisoners who had made the highest scores on the GED test, and they started off about 10 to maybe a dozen prisoners. And we took some courses, some history courses, soft courses, no mathematics, no physics, nothing like that. Just some social courses like history and some sociology courses and maybe psychology, 101, something like that. And we made tremendous grades. We aced it out. And so they decided to get this program started, and it got started. And then I kind of developed an academic friendship, for lack of a better term, with Professor John Dom, who had conservative politics, but he really believed in education. He was a firm believer in education. In fact, he believed that the prisoners' problem was that they needed education, that would take them away from crime because they would have them get jobs and so forth. He had a whole outlook on this. So it was an opportunity for us to get closer to getting out of prison. So we agreed with him. And we worked with him. And so he kept taking these issues before the prison authorities, and they kept, stalling him and whatnot. But something happened. I think it happened under Nixon, but I'm not sure. The government came up with a thing called Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. It was right around the time they were declaring the war on drugs. It's called LEAA. Professor John Dom, he studied that, and he found that there was a way through that particular piece of federal legislation to get block grants, because they were giving block grants out to the states for law enforcement. So some kind of way, with his genius, he tied that to education and was able to get a block grant to start a community college program inside the prison walls. Now, exactly how he did it, ABC, I don't know, but I know he did it, and he got that money. Now, and we got away with it for a number of years. Finally, the authorities, the same federal government that gave it to us, took it back. Under Reagan, when Reagan got in there, he ended all of that. But we had started something that created study release programs, they called them, all across the country at that time. This means that they were paroling prisoners out to go to college. Yeah. And even prisoners like myself who had a life and 50-year sentence. And we started a group called Lifers Incorporated. And we started out with like about 5 or 6 members of that group. And every member of that group, we got into the study release program. And they eventually got out. At first, we started out with the study release, releasing people to University of Missouri in Rolla, Missouri, which was a little small town where we couldn't get noticed. And then as it developed later on, years later, maybe half a decade later, we started getting prisoners released out to Lincoln University. Lincoln University was a Black university founded by Union soldiers after the Civil War, and it was in the same town that the prison was in. It was in Jefferson City. It sat on one hill. The maximum security prison sat on the other hill. We used to say on one hill was a school of higher learning, on the other hill was a school of lower learning. So we were able to get prisoners released into that university. Some of them got master's degrees. One of them, Larry Thomas, not only got a master's degree, but later on started teaching at the University of Missouri in Columbia. He's retired now, but he taught there for years. He still lives central Missouri, right outside of Columbia. So Joe Reynolds, he's still alive. He came through one of those programs. I came through one of those programs, and I mentioned in the front of my book, I was called back into the prison by some prisoners, about 4 or 5 years ago, and given an award. Part of the reason for them giving me that award was I helped to start an NAACP chapter in the prisons, and I helped to start this study release program in the prisons. So that's the long and short of that.
Yeah.
There's more details about it in the book, and I think I give a simpler explanation of it in the book than I just did.
when no, you contextualized it, right? So, context is a science and an art, right? So, no, and that's very important because there's been a, relatively uptick in studying political prisoners, that all of that work done has been obviously a positive uptick into that. So, as we kind of shift into the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which is one of the, the organization, and also was leading to the 50th year, which you all are going to be, organizing the conference around. But this, this work, this foundation becomes important. It's the importance of ideological formation, intellectual formation is fundamental in grounding and structuring the work to be done. So we've touched on it briefly in our conversation. Folk can go get your, your autobiography, but also the other book that you wrote as well, to get a more clear understanding of that. So now that we kind of set these markers, on the road to you and your organizing, once you're out of prison and you hit the ground running, right? You hit the ground running, organizing specifically. That eventually, obviously, one of the organizations that, again, is celebrating its 50th years, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. Could you talk a little bit about that formation and how that tied directly to, obviously, there's some obvious clear connections, but just to kind of elucidate them for, our listeners, talk about the development of the organization as a product of your organizing, as a product of your development and your experiences.
Wow. Well, the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression is a very important organization that grew out of the United Committees to Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. When Angela was captured and brought before the bar, facing a death sentence at the time, she was an important political prisoner because she came at the tail end of a whole wave of repression against the Black Liberation Movement, the murder and the jailing of members of the Black Panther Party, the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, the murder of Malcolm X, the murder of Medgar Evers, murder. J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA and the FBI and all of them combined together with the local police forces were determined more than we even understood at the time to destroy the Black liberation. We understood it later on because the church committee, a committee headed by Senator Church, which investigated the COINTELPRO program, the counterintelligence program, which is a program that was illegally put together by the CIA and the FBI. I should say the FBI and the CIA, because J. Edgar Hoover was the mastermind of all of this. It was involved in a very malicious attempt to destroy our movement. And they meant by murder, by deceit, by whatever means that they could destroy it, They wanted to destroy it. But I think J. Edgar Hoover said it in a nutshell that they didn't want a Black Messiah to come up no more. That's because that's how they saw King and Malcolm. They saw them like Black Messiah. And they thought that's what created movements. And we know better than that. We know that people create movements. And so they went against Fred Hampton's dictum. They thought they could kill a revolution by killing the revolutionary. And obviously that can't happen. So when Angela emerged, around the Soledad brothers, and when they tried to put these trumped up murder charges on her, our people had it up to here. They were really tired of this repression, this murderous repression that was being perpetrated against us. And we were determined not to let them take Angela Davis's life. Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of the United States. Within a matter of weeks after she was arrested in New York, over 200 defense committees spontaneously sprung up. They just called themselves committees of Free Angela Davis. They didn't even have no concept of defense committee. They just wanted to make sure that our sister did not go to jail and did not go to the gas chamber, which is what they had for execution in California at that time. And so the Communist Party stepped in because she was a member of the Communist Party, and they took all those committees that had spontaneously sprung up and united them under the leadership of one of the most brilliant organizers, I think, of the 20th century, Charlene Mitchell. Under her leadership, they put together the first Free Angela Davis Committee. And Angela Davis interjected and said, no, not just free me, free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. And then they changed the name to United Committees to Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. So they took on the tremendous task of uniting all of those committees. And I think by and large they did. In hundreds of cities throughout the United States, you had committees to Free Angela Davis. Now, there wasn't a major city in this country that didn't have a committee to Free Angela Davis, particularly if Black people were there. In a lot of small cities, small towns where there was significant Black population, or some Black people, they had committees to Free Angela Davis. This became a war cry in the Black community. Every entertainer, even some of those that had bad politics, like James Brown, was calling for the freedom of Angela Davis. Aretha Franklin was outstanding in her commitments to the Angela Davis defense. She said if the bill was $1 million, she'd put the bill up. Throughout the United States and in 67 different countries. 67 different countries. There were committees to Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners, and not just in the socialist bloc countries like the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and so on. The GDR, German Democratic Republic. They had huge committees there, but also in France, in England, in Africa, in South Africa, in Brazil, in Chile, all over the world. In Vietnam, in China, there were committees and movements to Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. And so this was much greater than the Scottsboro Boys case back in the 30s, which the Communist Party also had a role in organizing that. This was the most massive defense campaign in the history of the United States. More massive than Taco and Vanzetti, more massive than the Scottsboro, more massive than the 40 Square trials of the Reds, more massive than the Rosenberg cases. This is an unprecedented mass movement to Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. People were putting out songs for Angela. There was just a lot of activity. You couldn't hardly turn the radio or the TV on at any given moment without this case being mentioned. And then in the grand finale, the Furman versus Georgia case, the United States Supreme Court overturned the death penalty momentarily. But that was a very, very important moment because that was the moment while she was in jail, facing it. And so then we could make her bail. Once the death penalty was overturned, we could get out on bail. And then Angela was gotten out on bail and was able to participate in her own defense. An all-white jury acquitted her. And the first victory rally that I recall took place in Madison Square Garden with members of the leadership of the Communist Party sitting on the stage with Angela. Nothing like this had been seen before. Madison Square Garden was full. And I think there were people outside wanting to get in. It was full, And she came here and filled up the McCormick Inn here in Chicago. It was full. And she put a challenge to us. She said, now that I'm free, what about all political prisoners? And in answer to that challenge, in response to that challenge, we formed the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression in 1973. I was in prison when it was formed. Herschel Walker, who was the head of the Communist Party in Missouri, he told me it was being formed. And he said, we're going to get you out. That was in 1973. And I said to myself, I said, Herschel lost his mind. You know, I got life in 50 years. I don't think so, Herschel, you know. And that was in 1970. In 1976, I came home. 3 years later, I came home. I was paroled 3 years later. And I don't think it would have happened. In fact, I know it wouldn't have happened without this case. And a lot of people were able to fight back and win against these racist, political, repressive attacks because of this case and the victory that we won, and because of the establishment of the National Alliance Against Racism and Repression. When we were formed here on May the 17th in Chicago in 1973, over 700 delegates, or 700 would-be delegates, showed up at the conference. Every strand of the people's movement was at that founding conference. Everybody was there. Peace movement activists, the Chicano liberation people, the farm workers, organizing committee, various defense committees, Leonard Peltier, Clyde Bellecourt, the Native American American Indian movement. Everybody was there. The Berrigan brothers, you know, everybody. Movement leaders, intellectuals, all sorts of people came out for that founding conference. And within the first few years of our existence, you know, we took on the Wilmington 10 case, we took on the Joanne Lewis case, we took on the George Merritt case, we took on Martin Sostra's case, we took on Hurricane Carter's case, Reuben Hurricane Carter, we took on Julia Wild and Margaret, I can't, what was Margaret's last name? Margaret Bozeman, two voting rights activists who were framed up in Alabama. We took on all of these cases. And if you go back over these cases, we took a Joanne Little case and a Sada's case, you know, Sada Shakur, okay. We had a lot of the Black Panther Party cases. Some of these cases, a lot of these cases we won. We won more of these cases and got more people out of prison than any other national movement in this country. And we still exist, and we're still getting people out of prison. We're still winning cases. And so our 50th anniversary is going to be very important in terms of giving people a new spirit of fighting and hope and determination in this period when a lot of repression is coming down against us, you know. A lot of police crimes are being committed against our people. For the first time in the history of Chicago, first time in the history of the United States, we were able to get a piece of legislation passed empowering communities for public safety, where we have now created a democratically elected body of people, which will select a civilian body to oversee the police in real terms, in terms of making policy, in terms of stopping the gang database, in terms of stop and frisk, in terms of the unwarranted murders of people because they flee or because you think that they pose a threat to you because they pull their cell phone out, you know. We're going to have a chance to, in real terms, to address these issues and put some kind of regulation over the police that they've never had before. So this is a very important 50th anniversary.
Yeah, no, thank you for laying out that history. It was very important to really contextualize this because we're also in a moment where you have a proliferation of cop cities, the militarization of police, torture. So as we were just saying, you know, we wanted to really kind of, expand the conversation and talk about the relationship between, you're talking about Chicago, you're talking about the organizing work that grew out of the committees to free Angela Davis, that, of course, that really are targeting or looking at the repression, because the political repression that is producing the conditions and the militarization and the repression that is going on political activity. Now we have cop cities that are proliferating. The militarization of police have taken on, you know, this very aggressive state. You have torture. Chicago is implicated as being some of the, just like a lot of people say that apartheid South Africa learned from Jim Crow United States, this torture in Chicago, these so-called black sites proliferated themselves even during, came to light even during, the invasions of Iraq. This is related to the repression of the Palestinian people and these tactics that are being used and violence that are being used. How do we make sense of the world now? We have Palestinian people who are rising up. How do we make sense of these connections? And Chicago is a ground zero for a lot of the things that we're seeing internationally. The repression, the violence, the militarization, the torture sites, those type of things.
Well, I can address some of it.
Yeah, please do.
And what I can address, I can suggest an approach. Let me start with the Palestinians. I want to start there because I think that's the most important thing happening right now. And when I say most important, I mean revolutionary. And I said this in a speech I gave before a rally that was organized by our Palestinian comrades here in Chicago, that we're on the eve of one of the most important revolutions, well, the most important revolution of the 21st century right now. But I think one of the most important revolutions of the last century. Because here are people who have, for 100 years, and under apartheid Israeli regime for about 75 years, have been, they have been imprisoned in their own land. Gaza Strip is like a prison, 25 miles long and 5 miles wide. You put 2 million people in a space like that, and then you put walls around it, and you got settlements in there that are taking the best land, pockets of wealth, pockets of affluence, these settlements, these Jewish settlements, surrounded by the Palestinians who are living in dire poverty, who have a 70% unemployment rate, I think, among the youth, and about 50% among everybody. So the statistics are grim, but statistics don't have a human face. What you see over the news, what you see going on, like the carpet bumming, the bumming of hospitals, and they didn't just bum one hospital. They've been bumming hospitals for a minute. The systematic murder and slaughter of the Palestinian people, with the aim of eliminating them, with the aim of forcing them out of their own country, off their own land. This is taking place as we speak. Every 15 minutes, a Palestinian child is murdered. And the United States, without any shame, without any remorse, without any conscience, is saying that they support this stuff. Biden gets up there and says that Israel, you're not alone. But he's got it backwards. Palestine is not alone. The world is supporting Palestine. The world is not supporting Israel. The imperialist world is supporting Israel. The would-be rulers of the world in Europe and the United States is supporting Israel. And I said would-be rulers because they're on a slippery slope. Their days are numbered. That makes them all the more desperate and all the more illogical and fiendish in what they're doing. Because even members of his cabinet, even members of Biden's cabinet are saying to him, at least we know a lot of staff people have left. We know that. They couldn't keep that quiet because it's so stupid. It's so illogical what he's doing. What is more racist than the state of Israel right now as we speak? So much so until the South Africans, our South African comrades, have pulled the cover completely off of them. They have shown that what you have in Israel is an apartheid state, just as much as you had an apartheid state in South Africa at one time. this has been scientifically demonstrated. Nelson Mandela pointed it out before he died. So what's going on is that the Palestinian people, I'm not talking about Hamas, I'm talking about the Palestinian people, have drawn a line in the sand saying, no more, no more. You're not gonna exploit us, abuse us, brutalize us, and oppress us anymore. You're not gonna continue to kill our children and our families anymore without us giving you the best resistance that we can possibly give you. They're saying what Patrick Henry said, give us liberty or give us death. But we ain't accepting slavery no more. This is over. So whenever people do that, whenever they draw that line in the sand like that, it's the end. You know, it's the end. And these fascists, these racists, supported by the United States government with our tax dollars, they are saying out and out in the open, in clear and unmistakable language, that they are going to perpetrate genocide against the Palestinian people going forward, period. They are not talking about any compromise, they're not talking about any ceasefire, they're not talking about none of that. They're not talking about no negotiation. They're talking about exterminating a whole entire people and forcing them off their land. So this is a situation where there can be no neutrality. All freedom-loving people throughout the world have to come to the defense of the Palestinian people, have to stand in unconditional solidarity with the Palestinian people. Don't tell me about, I care about human life, you know, but the Israelis cannot say that they care about it because they only count Israelis. They're not counting all of the women and children that they're buried under that rubble in Gaza. They're not counting them. When you oppress people like that, you can't complain about terror. Just like the slaveholders couldn't complain about Nat Turner. They did, but we all understand what was going on. You know, a slave has the right to rebel, period. That's an unalienable right. You can't take that right away. Israel has no right to occupy those people's land. They have no right to occupy Palestinian land, and they have no right to perpetrate genocide against Palestinian people. And Palestinian people have a right to exist by every and any means necessary. And we support that. The National Alliance Against Race and Political Repression, we support that, we support that, we support that. We're not afraid to support it. We don't care about them calling us anti-Semitic and all of that. We support that. We support that. You're not going to frighten us with this. You're not going to get us to thinking that because you accuse us of being racist, that excuses the racism of Israel. There's no racism in reverse here. We're talking about an apartheid, racist, fascist state that's perpetrating genocide against people who are mainly defenseless in terms of military. And you're carpet bombing these people, you know.
And the fact that you know, the connections become very, very clear, right? You know, we're talking about the militarization of the police and their tactics. We talk about the let
me just speak on that for a second,
please.
Okay, we say not another dime to Israel. No American dollars should go to supporting the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. But we also say this, that occupation is a crime from the United States to Palestine and from Palestine to the United States. The Black communities and the brown communities of this country are also being occupied by racist cops who murder us with impunity, who brutalize and torture us and send us to jail with impunity. John Burge, who tortured all of those people and had all those, we got damn near 500 people in prison right now as a result of frame-up torture cases that were engineered in the beginning by John Burge, but now being carried on by his descendants. He never faced trial for that. He went to trial for lying. He never went to trial for torture. He drew a pension while he was in jail. The same police force here in Chicago and the same police force in Israel, they belong to the same international association. They exchange data. They work with one another. The New York Police Department has an office also in Tel Aviv, okay? So we are clear. We're clear about what the connections are. We're clear as to why we stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and also with the Filipino people, with people anywhere in the world who are fighting against U.S. imperialism, because we are fighting against it here ourselves. We're fighting against it here because that's the same system that's holding our people in bondage. And black faces in high places ain't gonna change that fact. Every time I look at the decision in the United Nations where all of the nations are talking about, except for maybe 2 or 3, are talking about in the occupation in Palestine, ceasefire, and the United States vetoes it in the United Nations, and they got a black woman sitting there. I mean, you can't say shame because they ain't got no shame. You can't say shame. They don't have that. They are flunkies. They are committed to the same thing that Biden is committed to, and they're proving it by their deeds. I salute those people in his administration that have the courage to say, no, we're not going to go along with this. I denounce those people, like those in the United Nations and those in the military, who are just going along with the program of murdering innocent people, going along with the program of genocide, which makes them guilty too. They are guilty. They can't, if war crimes are being committed, they are complicit in it.
I wanted to, as we come to a point where we can take a break or a pause, let's talk about, because in your The Damned Don't Cry, in your autobiography, you towards the end of it, you talk about, some steps of organizing. Again, your reflections on the current moment, and also the opportunities, the burgeoning. I mean, you have, I mentioned this earlier in our conversation, that we have more young folk, young scholars and folk who are interested in really studying political prisoners and the organizing efforts there. We have a number of folk that are really kind of, there's organizing on the ground. In your book, you make a very important base building, at that local level, community level, and then obviously moving up towards the national and, of course, the international level. What are some of the things from your perspective that folk can take away from this conversation in this current moment as we are witnessing, the violent aggression, the naked, absolute violent aggression and violence from the Palestinian people that has a long history, that is related to the violent repression of the colonial question of African people and people of African descent? What are some takeaways? What are something that, if someone is listening at this particular point in our conversation, what is it that, if those who are listening to this and they want to do something, there's always like, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We have organizations that are doing some work, but go ahead.
Let me suggest to them that they come to our conference. That's something that you can do right away, because our conference starts on November the 3rd. Right here in Chicago, at the Chicago Teachers Union Hall. You can go to conference.naarpr.org, conference.naarpr.org, and you'll get the information about the conference. Because at that conference, we're going to be discussing, we're going to be discussing all of these issues, but we're also going to be coming up with a program of action for the next 2 years. We have a conference every 2 years. And so it would be very important for you to come and not only learn about what we're doing, but also participate and make some commitments about what you're going to do in the future. We got to take a special responsibility as a movement to put pressure on our government here in the United States of North America to cease and desist in the funding of Israel. Right now, before the Congress, they're talking about sending billions of dollars. They ain't even refinished the Build Back Better. They haven't even finished the Build Back Better that they talked about as a result of COVID, that they promised when they was running for election, but they want to send billions of dollars to Israel and to the Ukraine, So we have to make a sharp and insistent demand that this not happen. And how do we connect that demand up to what we're doing here in the United States? Is that we also got this problem here in the United States. Let me give you an example. In Chicago, $2 billion. That's the police budget here in Chicago. $2 billion. There is no social program. We're talking about housing, employment, healthcare, no social program getting that kind of money. In fact, under neoliberalism that's been dominating Chicago for the last 50 years, what they've been doing is cutting social programs, closing schools, closing mental health facilities. So at the same time, they got a bloated budget like that. So why is that? Because they are funding repression. They know that these conditions create social unrest. They know that our people are going to be protesting against these conditions, trying to change these conditions. They know that we're going to be doing things like empowering communities for public safety like we're doing. So what they're going to do in response to this, they're going to beef up the police. Beef them up for what? Beef them up to put us down. Beef them up to put us down. And so we have got to put a stop to this. We've got to cut these budgets, these bloated budgets for the police departments, not only in Chicago, but all across the United States, And we can do that with a people's movement, a grassroots people's movement, because the politicians that vote for these things, the politicians that support for these things, we have to stand against them. We have to quit giving them our votes. We have to organize on the local level in the communities to fight them. We may not get all that we fight for, but we got to fight for all we get. We have to fight them and let them know that going forward, we are not accepting this. This is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. And that fight starts right now. In fact, it's already started. It's already started in Chicago, but it's going to start everywhere because people are waking up. It's going to start everywhere. And we have got to fight them and let them know that this is unacceptable, that what we want from the police, we want to be in control of how the policing is done in our communities. That's what we want, because the police have proven themselves to be unfit. They've proven themselves to be agents of a kind of a genocide perpetrated against the Black community and the brown community. They're killing our kids too, Not at the same rate that they're killing them in Palestine, but they're killing them. They're killing them. They shot a 17-year-old child here 16 times. And the guy did less than 5 years in prison. The racist cop that did that. Adam Toledo, I think he was 15 years old, murdered him. Nothing has been done about that,
Right.
So we have got to stop this. We've got to stop funding this repression, this murderous repression against ourselves. We got to stop that. And we can only stop that by fighting and taking community control of the police. We've got to do that. Here in Chicago, we've had a serious break in that direction with the election of Mayor Johnson. But the powers that be are fighting back. They're trying to take back with a shovel what they gave us with a teaspoon. So we got to stand up and fight back. And we've proven in Chicago that if we organize in the community, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, district by district, because that's what we did here. And we're still doing it. If we do that, we can bring about some changes. But we can't talk these changes about. We have to organize them and bring them about. And that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned again, this opportunity, and as we again kind of move to a point where we can pause in our conversation, because of course our next conversation, I really want to get into your your other book, Black Liberation and Socialism.
So
But
can we schedule that for another time?
yeah. No, that's later. Yeah, we're not going to do that today. No, that's a whole.
I got another meeting I got to go to.
No, I just wanted to, as we close, to really just briefly talk about, in this organizing, the importance of internationalism or international solidarity.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
If you could just, briefly talk about that. I know you have to go. Yeah, no, we're going to schedule that conversation a whole another day. But
absolutely, sure.
Yeah, talk a little bit about, just briefly, the importance of international, because it's coming out of a tradition, right? This is coming out of the, the international revolutionaries with the Comintern. We have a clear internationalist perspective, specifically in Black liberation movements that was repressed, particularly 1930s, all the way up into the 1960s, even up right now. So
well, just to kind of sum it up, let me quote some Martin McKell. He said that solidarity is not an act of charity. We stand in solidarity with the anti-imperialist movements of the world, and at this moment, very sharply, in solidarity with Palestine and the Philippines, because of mutual suffering. We have the same common enemy: colonialism, imperialism, monopoly capitalism, the same common enemy. And it's a choice. Well, it's no choice. Whether or not we're going to struggle against this enemy is not an option. But whether or not we're going to struggle united is not an option either. Because we have proven over and over again that united, the people united, particularly crossing borders. You see, the imperialists, the monopoly capitalists, they have no borders. They don't have any borders. They're all over the world. And so if we're going to fight against them, solidarity has no borders either. Solidarity has no borders. We stand in solidarity with people everywhere that are fighting against imperialism. And it's got to be like that. It's got to be like that, because it is more of us than it is them. We can unite the many against the few, as Mao Zedong used to say.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of us than it is them. And as a politician once said, and I'm not going to give you this guy's name because sometimes he comes out with some reactionary stuff, but it's one thing he said that was good. He says, the power of the people is greater than the people in power. So in one of his enlightening moments, he was seeing that it's more of us than it is them. The power of the people is greater than the people in power. But that's true only if we are united and organized. United and organized. The Alliance slogan is that organization plus unity plus struggle equals victories. Now, there's a lot of particulars I could get into on this question, but we don't have the time. But I just want to say that international solidarity is very important. We couldn't bring down apartheid in South Africa without it. We can't divesting in Israel, boycotting Israel, continuing to have these mass demonstrations and protests, continuing to put pressure on our government not to give one more dollar to the Israeli racist apartheid regime. This kind of solidarity will bring a victory. We must practice it. We must do it.
Thinking specifically as we end, I'm thinking specifically of El-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, really getting in a lot of his speeches, he talked about this this consciousness of the masses, to be conscious of the numbers, be conscious of the fact that there are millions of Black people and African people around the world. So Malcolm X, of course, becomes that lens that which we can look. And I do want to make sure that we just I guess as a point of clarity, you mentioned Herschel Walker. We're not talking about the Herschel Walker.
No. I'm talking about I'm talking about a Black man in St. Louis who's from Arkansas, who helped form the Sharecroppers Union back in Arkansas back in the 30s, who helped get me out in the 60s. I'm talking about the statewide chairman of the Missouri Communist Party in St. Louis, that Herschel Walker.
We wanted to make sure for our listeners, because we know we have
no longer with us, but he was a great dedicated comrade.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Well, listen, I want to thank you, and this will not be the last time we talk, but I know you have to run, so I want to just thank you for taking your time on a Sunday to have this important conversation. And I will put all of the information for the conference, make it available for everyone, and we looked ourselves to show up as well.
Yeah, well, I want to end up by saying this here, because we never did say it. We talk a lot about communists and so forth and so on. But I want to say that the communist organization that I now belong to is called the Freedom Road Socialist Party. So those of you who are interested, check us out.
That's right.
His own story was as curious as his narrative. The tale of his life is the tale of a writer of incredible vision.
That's it for Africa Woke Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. Follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram at Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research, content contributor, and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Orderson, technology advisor it's Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa Woke Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
It's my friends. It's one of the greatest technological advances in modern history. Behold, a confectionery behemoth. Candyman, spit me a dream. Blow a chunk of the levy out and spit me a stream. Knock a man house down and build a casino. A $2,000 government check from Fiend. I swam down Shit's Creek and came up clean with a new lease on life like Andy Dufresne. It's the most poetical, Nat King unforgettable. Clarence 13X, a lost rhapsody from Bellevue. I'm splitting atoms, spitting flames, bringing change. Things will never be the same. I got the rap game, singing that last like Etta James. Lames get they plane shot down like John McCain. It's a dream, the flow's elegant like Miss Coretta Scott King. A lot of kings sing deaf and turn queen. Crack they 24-inch rims in the ravine. Respect the architect, never test the Elohim. Good night, this is JLF live from New Orleans.
My journey has brought me to an understanding of the divine forces with which we have all been bestowed. It was in this search that I came upon a revelation, which has called me to guide millions of people towards their righteous destiny.
We're gonna do a song. We're gonna do a song that you never heard before. Who's going to hit us now? We are the strongest.
Babe, I spit that orchestral Medina born exceptional, extraterrestrial from out the ghetto vestibule. Put your yard up on knowledge like the lessons do. So fly fiends can get high off the residue. So real and surreal, the pure deal. Dante Flacco, flow handsome, guapo. The sun, moon, and stars, grits in the gospel. School and knock harder and the teachings of apostles. Pistols, prayer meetings, player balls, car shows, festivals, funerals. The grotesque and beautiful. Phenomena is normal. The needed hardly happens. Fresh V's at high speeds, zooming backwards. Fast
world famous Mr. Magic Rap Attacks presents a world.
Show them the truth, can't make them believe it though. It's curtains, the opening scene. Somebody go remarkable, the article dream. Wake up and bear witness to what you never seen. Reach out and feel what they said could never be. Me and J-A-Y-E, electronic motherboard, shut them off, they sucker sauce.
J45, homie, J45, homie.
Stargate, I go in, I bust
through the gates of hell like a battering ram. Clapping, yelling profanities like Yosemite Sam. After that, I'm back home scanning the land. 23 million square miles of contraband. I know you feel me, but still hope the opposition kill me, cause you don't wanna see